think we'll go ahead and get started. As usual, I'll do a kind of a rolling start in case other people join in the next few minutes. But thank you again for joining us on the Thursday evening Dharma talk. Um, I'll try to talk a little bit about where we left off because I know we are doing this hybrid traditional style, which to go through the text line by line. I've said this in the past to some people when we were doing this in person. The very, very traditional style is you would actually go word by word. And reason for that, partially in Chinese, was in classical Chinese, the not all the characters were known to people. So they would first actually have to start with the pronunciation of those characters and then why they were chosen for translation from Sanskrit to Chinese, and then clarifying maybe the common meaning for the Buddhist meaning. So to give you an example, in English, we don't have a lot of words that are combined together that have totally different meanings from our common usage. But we do have words that sound alike. So night, like a night on horseback, and nighttime. You will often in classical Chinese run into the issue where classical Chinese predated the as a written language predates most other written languages, and these characters had a set meaning in etymology and history. So when they were choosing words to try to approximate Sanskrit terms or translate these terms, they actually had to come up with a glossary of what words would mean what, because many of these words didn't have a meaning elsewhere. So there's a lot of specific terms about consciousness, mind, and philosophy that didn't exist in other parts of East Asia. So it's very common that if you read these terms in classical Chinese, you might be able to pronounce them or struggle through the pronunciation. But even a native Chinese speaker, unless they're a Buddhist scholar or student, would have no idea what they're reading about. It would have no logical meaning. So part of that traditional lecture style comes from this translation issue. If you do just hit your head and decide to learn classical Chinese and you listen to those style of lecture, there's a tremendous amount of Buddhist history and knowledge that you'll get out of them. That's the upside. The downside is if you don't have a tremendous amount of patience, you may find that going word by word, I've actually sat in lectures in Chinese where 1 month we're on one sentence, just going through all the meanings, the different places those words and terms show up. And so it can be very different from any kind of lecture style that we're used to in the West. So I call this a hybrid style, meaning we're going through the text, but not in that level of detail. I will, however, try to clarify, you'll see in the English, where some Sanskrit texts, Sanskrit terms are left untranslated. That's where I'm trying to bring out more detail, or where I think it would benefit in translation to give more detail on where these terms come from. So I apologize in advance for the maybe sometimes too detailed, or we spend a lot of time in one or two pages. But it's interesting to me. You can send me hate mail if you don't find it interesting. The audience gets smaller and smaller, then I'll know this is not a favorite style. So that's kind of part of the reason we go through the text in this way. Part of the other reason is and when I say as we lecture the text, so I can't do this without all of you. As we go through it, we're bringing it to life in a way that's relevant to us today. So some of the things written in the Awakening of Faith, Asva Gosha was specifically writing for an audience long before any of us were thought of. So some of those terms and issues need some updating or can benefit from updating. And others, you've sometimes heard me talk about kind of the philosophical background. I try not to get into it too deeply. This was a time when there was a lot of debate between different monastic complexes and Buddhist groups about what the Buddha meant, or kind of adding additional color commentary, so to speak, on certain ideas. So things that the Buddha didn't lecture in depth. So I try to avoid some of that because it really gets into the weeds of like doctoral dissertation type stuff, which then everyone's head will fall back and I'll just see snoring across the screen. So sometimes I'll just mention it, like footnote. So this is what they're talking about, but we'll gloss over it. So that's just a little background, kind of our rolling start, just to, if you joined us more recently and wonder, gosh, why are we going so slow? That's part of the reason. So that's how I initially learned a lot of these texts. So it's hard to break free of that style. So I apologize in advance. That's also, I should say, within Shingon transmission, that is actually still the style. So you will get a ritual manual or a particular text you're studying, and it is explained character by character. And then the expectation is you will practice it for a while. And by a while, Americans might think, oh, a few days. Of course, in Asia, they may say like a decade or so, or years. You'll practice for some time and then come back with questions, answers, or points of clarification. But the Asian Confucian education model expects you to do a lot more work than a Western student would expect. So if you go to class, pretty much throughout Western education, so K through grade 24, or however far you go, you expect that if you do the reading, the lecturer, whomever, is going to be willing or available to answer questions at the next class. That's not so much the style in the Confucian education model. So it is sometimes considered disrespectful to ask questions. The implication being the teacher didn't explain it well enough the first time. So a lot of students stay quiet. That doesn't work here in this country. So if you have questions, feel free to ask. And if you're not comfortable asking it out loud, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat box. If that doesn't work, feel free to email. It's not uncommon that people ask clarification later. And sometimes that really helps me explain things better too. So I appreciate it. Okay, so all of that talking, we'll get back into the text. So we left off on page 29. I'll try to share the screen here. There you go. So hopefully you can see that. If there's any trouble, technological stuff, please let me know. On my side, it's just the document that I shared has like a little green box around it, but I'm not sure if I move it around or scroll if it stays on screen, if you can see it. So please let me know. If you have the actual book, that'll be page 49 of the printed book, and then the PDF, I think, is page 29. So this section is consciousness. So I think it's helpful to just kind of remind us where we are. Why does the text go into consciousness here? The awakening of faith is at this stage explaining the process of the mind, or the fact that the mind has these two aspects. We've already earlier discussed one of those aspects. So if you go back in PDF anyway to page 26, there's this quote, that a person is in samsara results from the fact that his mind and consciousness develop on the ground of the storehouse consciousness. So the text previously discussed the mind, and now it's moving on to discussion of the consciousness. So that's kind of where we we left off. So this is a key feature of the awakening of faith, this idea of the mind with two aspects. Um, so this is a little bit more of an important point. And because of that, I'm going to take this section slower. So we're going to talk about this section a little bit, and then we're going to do more practice this evening that I think is relevant for our current times, hopefully. So here's the actual text. What is called consciousness, vijnana, is the continuing mind. Because of their deep-rooted attachment, ordinary people imagine that I and mine are real and cling to them in their illusions. As soon as objects are presented, the consciousness rests on them and discriminates the objects of the five senses and of the mind. This is called vijnana, the differentiating consciousness, or the separating consciousness. Or again, it is called the object discriminating consciousness. This propensity for discrimination of the consciousnesses will be intensified by both the intellectual defilement of holding fast to perverse views and the affectional defilement of indulgence and passion. Oh, that's a mouthful. Okay. So we're going to spend some time on this. And the first thing I want to just note is, especially right now, we in the United States or in the West don't generally use the term discrimination in the way that it's meant here in the text. So we're not talking about legal protections and discrimination on the basis of some protected class. We're talking about the mind's tendency to make distinctions. So to see something and say, that one's bigger, that one's smaller, that one's taller, that one's shorter, that one's lighter, that one's darker, that one's heavier, that one's lighter. We instantly begin to make distinctions between things. And that helps us evolutionarily, through the course of evolution. This has been very useful for living beings. So if you are, let's go back to an imagined Paleolithic era where people are running away from dinosaurs. I don't think that's actually how it went down, but for the benefit of my hypothetical, it's more fun. You come around the corner of a big rock and you see other humans. So you have to really quickly determine, are they the same clan? Are they friendly or aggressive? Because your life and survival may depend on it. Your group may depend on it. You come around another corner and you see a small bird-like creature with claws, and you have to distinguish very quickly, is it edible? Is it harmful? Or do you need more people to capture it? So you're making these distinctions. So you see this same process going on. Actually, I watched the process earlier today with my cat, trying to figure out if the bug was on the inside or the outside of the window and if they should pounce, and what was the likelihood of them smushing their face into the glass if they miscalculated. So this is a natural process of the mind. The philosophical problem that the text is trying to point out to us is we do it ad infinitum. We don't stop. We're constantly going through this, and we have lost our connection with this original capability of the mind to just see things as they are before this parsing process starts. When I first encountered this concept, I thought, well, there is nothing before that. And it's only, I think, through some level of meditation practice, quieting of the mind, that you begin to recognize that even if it's very momentary, the gap between your confronting something and the kind of mind entering this parsing and dividing and categorizing phase. So I tell the story because this is when I first noticed it. So I've been practicing Buddhism since I was, or dabbling. I can't say I was a formal practitioner because there were no temples where I grew up, but that did not dissuade the younger me meditating on my bedroom floor. So I went to China when I was 19, and it was the first time I encountered Buddhism in practice. And I remember I used to, between hunting for ancient temples, would always walk through the various markets. It was very fascinating at the time. All kinds of things that we didn't have for sale in the United States, and definitely things that we didn't eat in the United States. Some of them, you knew what they were. Other things I actually had a hard time trying to figure out, was it an animal? Was it a vegetable? Was it a spice? Did you eat it? Did you use it for decoration? And you kind of have something, I guess the closest you can explain it was almost like your computer crashing. You can see it would just freeze up. So I had these moments where you're like, you just have no idea what category to put it into. So that's when I thought, oh, this is what the teaching is talking about, where there is this space between the division and the, as it says here, discrimination, the discriminating mind. So I was only really aware of it because of reading things like this. I think I probably would have used a different term to describe it now versus without the benefit of some Buddhist education. But there's this process that the consciousness goes through. And this becomes very important in meditation. So one of the reasons why it's important is you may experience, finally you kind of really relax, finally you start to stop grasping at things so much, the mind, and generally the first time it happens without you being consciously aware, it may be frightening. The body may tense up as soon as you become aware of it happening, because the normal process of the mind that's constantly reaffirming your existence took a break. And there's a part of the ego that is definitely afraid of that. So there is a aspect of this discriminating mind that is always inserting yourself into it. So that thing is closer to me, farther away from me. That is bigger than me, smaller than me, taller than me, shorter than me. So it's not just, is it taller or bigger? It's always in relation to yourself. And that's part of your ongoing mental chatter, saying, you're alive, you're alive, you're alive, you're alive, you're alive. Me, 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 me. And the moment that subsides, it can be a little scary because it's not within our everyday experience. So part of the reason I think the text is teaching us about this is Buddhism is not study alone. It is also practice. But without study, the meditation alone is rarely beneficial. So when you have this kind of foundation philosophically, then you understand a little bit more what's going on with the meditation. Then you can gauge if you're making progress. You may be able to more easily gauge where the bigger hurdles are, and then also, if there's actual, if you're doing it properly. So the Buddhist sutras are filled with monks and lay people coming to the Buddha, getting more detailed, finer points of meditation because they've been doing it incorrectly. And one of the biggest sort of incorrect ways is a trance-like state. So oftentimes people are engaging in meditation as escapism or strictly for the relaxation side effects. Is it good to have relaxation? Yes, you want to be relaxed when you meditate, but it shouldn't only be that. So I often make the point that the ancient world knew how to make beer. So if it was only for relaxation, there was easier ways than going up in the mountains and meditating if it was strictly relaxation. So they did have recreational activities. So that was not the primary goal. I think what's different in the relaxation that results from meditation is you have it all the time. You're going to have it in the midst of a very difficult situation or confrontation. You're going to have it, in the midst of you're driving down the highway. You're going to have it in, if you're in school, if you're studying, you're going to have it in the workplace. You're going to have it in your relationships. You're going to have it all the time. You're not dependent on something outside. Once it's obtained, you have it. So it's a natural. You can pilot an aircraft with it. They're not going to stop you before before you get behind the stick of the 747. So these are some of the benefits. So this is kind of the introduction here. We do run into this Sanskrit term, vijnana. So the text is telling us how the mind functions by labeling this cognitive ability as vijnana. So it's helpful to parse this out. What it's doing is parsing out all the functions of the mind and the way consciousness operates. And I think this is important for a couple reasons. Not only important for Buddhist practice, it's important because in the West, or in our modern scientifically driven worldview, there is no coherent definition or working model of consciousness. So whether you go from philosophy to neuroscience, there's no agreed upon definition of consciousness. Buddhism has a really, really developed model, and I think it's actually a benefit and could be learned and gifted to science. There's a lot that could be learned there about how consciousness functions. And if you actually look at a lot of newer psychotherapy methods, they're drawing bit by bit from Buddhist philosophy and practice and understanding how the mind works, and then what practices are more common. I was, about a year ago, I was actually at a local middle school, and I went into the counselor's office, and there was a bell just like this on his desk. And I said, "Oh, that's interesting," because it's a public school. So I said, "That's a very nice bell." And he said, "Yes, we use it for mindfulness meditation for students with anxiety and different things like that." So little by little, it's sort of seeping in and benefiting people in ways that they probably weren't aware of before. One of the things that's different and I think really unique in Buddhist philosophy is this concept of mind isn't just a definition or working model. It's also a way to observe, understand, and interact and actually affect the mind. So you can actually affect change upon this mind. So and I think this is what differentiates philosophy from religion and science. So is Buddhism philosophy? Is it a religion? Is it a science? Is it both? Philosophy generally is intent on developing a model of understanding, not necessarily in affecting a change. That is sometimes left up to other social and hard sciences or functional sciences, or medicine or chemistry or something like that. Religion usually has a practice of affecting change on an individual, and there's usually some ethical guidelines. And then science is a method of understanding, but it doesn't in and of itself have ethical guidelines. So I think all of these areas of study are important to do together. There's a lot of things we can do in science, but the question is, should we? So you have ethicists and people like that. So what should you do? What's beneficial? And where do you draw those answers, or where do you draw inspiration from for those decisions on what's ethical? So this is the area I think that Buddhism is really helpful, and especially in this understanding of the function of the mind. This is something fairly unique that Buddhism has, and I think we'd be happy to share it. So if you have scientific friends, send them over, and we'll try to get people helped out. So so vijnana, going back to the original term, Um, Vijnana is sometimes described as consciousness, sometimes described as aggregates or aggregates of consciousness. So if you, when we do the services, we read the Heart Sutra in English. So you'll come across the line, the 5 skandha are sunya, or the 5 aggregates are all empty. So here are the aggregates of consciousness that the Vijnana is discussing. So it's form, so actual materiality of the body or materiality of things that we come into contact with in the universe. Feeling, so all of your receptive functioning of the body and how that plays out into the mind. So your touch and taste and sense, all these feeling stuff. Perception, generally we're discussing when you see something, how it's perceived, and remember back to science class, how light refracts in the eye, how that image is then rendered in the mind. So it's this actual physical functioning. Then sometimes will, or your intentionality about things, which is generally associated with you projecting an intent back based on the sensory input. So that's where craving and things like this begin. And then consciousness. So this is the Vijnana. So based on those various inputs, you have this discriminating function. So in my caveman analogy, you come around the corner and you quickly assess the scene, and you determine it's not dangerous and this is a potential food source. And so then you desire the food source and you hatch a plan to acquire the food source. So this is the discriminating consciousness, the Vijnana process. They are defined differently depending on the school of Buddhism. So one of the reasons Asvagosha is writing at this time is the Theravada Southern Buddhist schools in the Abhidharma looked at Vijnana in one way, and the burgeoning Mahayana schools looked at it in a much more layered way. So both were trying to address and flesh out some of the things that Buddha said and provide more detail. So this is where we get into kind of some of the debates between the schools. That's not important for us tonight. I just want to mention it in case you've seen different definitions in readings or come across it explained in different ways. One of the reasons why you might see that is different schools of Buddhism will define it differently depending on if they're referring to Mahayana text or Pali text. So that's just footnote. I'm going to rehash or review the last few sentences of that, or the last sentence of that paragraph. So some of the descriptions here might seem harsh, so I just want to comment on that. So it says, the propensity for discrimination of this consciousness will be intensified by both the intellectual defilement of holding fast to perverse views and the affectional defilement of indulgence and passion. So you might be thinking, but I like indulging in passion. It's a lot of fun. It feels good. What's wrong with that? So I would say, keep in mind, Asvagosha is writing for a monastic audience. So his audience at that time, ideally, or to whom he thought this text is being addressed, remember this is before corner bookstore and New York Times bestseller list. The intent in writing was to clarify questions primarily amongst those who had renounced the home life. So it would be inappropriate for them to indulge in passion. Not to say that there's something inherently wrong with enjoyment. That's not what the text means. So just to clarify. The above portion, I think, is really relevant to some of the issues we encounter either ourselves or we observe. And it's that holding fast to perverse views. So when it's talked about in a Buddhist sense, it's generally meaning you're holding on to non-Buddhist views, or you're holding on to views of the world that don't accord with cause and effect. And the cause and effect model is, I think, fairly logical. I'm biased, obviously, but oftentimes it's easy to slip into more hopeful feelings, I think, where we are hoping that there will be some miraculous change in an obvious cause and effect relationship. And so it's warning against that. It's also warning, you see the kind of intellectual defilement, meaning we sometimes will intellectualize ourselves into a fairly narrow view of the world, or one that serves a purpose that's beneficial to us but not actually helpful for our spiritual path, or nor is it compassionate. So I think there's a million different examples of that, right? A few years ago I saw what was the 80s movie? Oh, Wall Street. I rewatched the movie Wall Street, the whole greed is good thing. So a great example of trying to redefine terms that would have never been thought of as of benefit, and recasting them as something beneficial for an American model of capitalism because it serves that model. I'm not going to comment on whether it's good or bad, but I think that's just a good example. So it's just asking us to be a bit careful about that intellectual capacity. So we're all good at intellectualizing our way into or out of problems. So, well, just this one time, or who's going to know, and that kind of thing. There's another thing I want to mention too, since technically you're all engaged in, I know this may sound odd, but non-American Buddhism. So by that I mean Shingon is a still traditional school, continuously transmitted in Japan for over 1,200 years. Those of us here in the United States are few and far between. Imanaka sensei in Seattle and myself, doing stuff on Zoom is very unusual. To see that and to come into contact with Shingon is unusual. So technically, by the academic standards, we fall into ethnic Buddhism, meaning we still bear, which is funny because I'm looking at everyone and this is quite multi-ethnic actually, but we still practice in a manner that is far more similar to what you'll see in Japan than you will see at some place that says Dharma Center rather than temple. So chief amongst those would be those Confucian inspired practices like memorial services and holidays. Strange. So I mention that because there's another piece behind what Asagosha is writing, and what he's writing is a very traditional and I think honest and heartfelt view from a more traditional viewpoint that Buddhists would consider it rare to be born as a human, and even more rare to encounter the Dharma. So he is very subtly reminding his reader, hey, don't waste your time. Don't get caught up with too much frivolous stuff, because you may not have as much time as you think to do this practice. So, work hard. And and this is a subtle reminder. So that is the the traditional view. So you often see these kind of exhortations that I think initially sound a bit severe, but they're really meant to as encouragement. So if we turned it around for a modern audience, you might um, you might tell a young person, hey, not everybody gets in this university, so limit the parties and buckle down and study and make sure you get the most out of it. So I think it should be read in that sense. So again, remembering who the audience was. One thing I want to also mention, it's common, at least so my educational background, I try to think, how do you actually apply this in daily life? How do you actually take this teaching from the Christian and into society? So full disclosure, I was a political science, international relations as my undergrad. So trying to think of, how do you affect peace? How do you affect change in reality? That's always sort of in the back of my mind when I'm reading this. And my Midwestern upbringing, somewhere back there, someone said, all you do is Buddhists just sit on cushions and navel gaze. How is that helping anyone? So I think it's helpful to think about that and take up the challenge and give it some thought. And how do we make this teaching relevant? So I think it's fair to ask, is the teaching relevant, right? Is it relevant to 2020? And if you're struggling to answer that, then that's potentially a hurdle for your practice. If you're going to come upon a thought like, this isn't really helpful, that's going to be the thing that breaks down and you decide maybe you don't want to practice anymore. It's good to ask, are we helping by meditating? Or are we actually practicing escapism? So that's a question I think we need to address. And then, is this practice, is the teaching actually addressing this type of suffering that we see in the world? As a student of history, I don't think there's much different now than during ancient times, other than the speed with which news flows. So, but the issues are largely the same. You can look into either Greek or ancient Chinese history and find examples of the same behavior in politics and society. But I do think it's helpful to reassess and kind of look at the teaching and say, how do we apply it to the issues that we're facing today? So if you're thinking this way, it's good because you're planting the seeds of compassion. So if you look at all the Mahayana sutras, inevitably you'll come upon an entry where the Buddha is discussing a premonition or discussing someone's future enlightenment. And they're pinpointing a point in time where that burgeoning bodhisattva identifies some type of suffering and says, this is the thing I want to fix. This is where I want to help. This I can't sleep at night. It's so on my mind. If I attain enlightenment, this is what I'm going to fix. These are the people I want to help. So I think it's only fair that we think the same way, and we try to make this teaching relevant in that way. So these are we're sowing the seeds of the development of our compassion by thinking about that. So given that, I want to spend the second half. I spent a whole half of class talking about one paragraph. See, I told you, you go word by word, but I think we've gone in depth, in the deep-rooted attachment part. So switch gears a little bit and kind of working off our last class. I talked a little bit about the Metta Sutta. So having regard and compassion for all living beings and where that shows up. So I thought tonight, for a couple of reasons, it would be good to do a little bit of practice on compassion meditation. So our world is still in quarantine. I've heard from some people who still have quite a bit of anxiety about that. I was talking to someone earlier today, and they were wondering when is it going to be safe. They were very concerned about even taking their family to the beach. They didn't want to stay. They were worried about cleanliness of rooms and things like that. And regardless of um, what stage of reopening our part of the country is, or what our opinions are on those things, I think what's most important here is that people still have this a high level of anxiety. Someone calling and being in anguish about should they allow their children outside. So that's huge. So the other part is if you follow the news at all, we have a lot of social unrest in the country, right? So we have people actively clashing with police, National Guard called out once again. And I think sadly, the cycle of that anguish happens more frequently. When I was growing up, I only heard about, the riots in the 60s. I grew up seeing the scars of them, but I didn't see any more mass protests like that. In the last 10 years, I've seen more of that than ever before. So unfortunately, I think we're on somewhat of a cycle. And so regardless of how you read those news stories or how they touch you or affect you, I think we have to recognize that they affect us because we're part of the society. We're part of this country. So it has an effect on us. Even if, I do have friends and acquaintances that say they're not surprised at all. And so, they're just waiting for the next case. I know people who, are looking at, they focus on the protest and say, that's what upsets them. I think as Buddhists, we should look at the root causes that lead our society to those things. But at any rate, it's very distressing. It's very distressing that we have now 100,000 people who have died of COVID-19, and at the same time, we have people, kind of running battles in the street in American cities with police and National Guard. So all the things that lead to that are failings in our society and our compassion for one another that were planted a long time ago. So none of this is new. One of the things I also want to mention is it's affecting us differently now because of how we get our news. So we probably have seen some of this stuff on regular, traditional broadcast news outlets, whether we're watching it live or, we're watching it on the internet, but from those kind of, big 4 or 5 broadcast outlets. I think we're also getting a lot of it from social media. And in fact, social media is the news today. So I wanted to take a moment to kind of relate this part of the awakening of faith to why, to some degree, we find ourselves in the situation we're in. And I think is actually very relevant to this aspect of the mind. So why does social media work? It works because when we see something inflammatory or objectionable, we react to it. And the way social media is programmed, anything that's getting more eyeballs floats to the top. So the more outrageous thing that happens, or the most outrageous thing someone says, floats to the top because it gets more people either piling on saying, yeah, something crazy. And then a bunch more people saying, I can't believe this person said something so crazy. So it rises to the top, and then it enters the news cycle of but there's a lot of people talking about this crazy thing. And, but let's go to the guy in the field. Hey, Jim, what do you think? Well, a lot of people out here think it's crazy, and these other people think it's, really reasonable. That becomes the story. And if you think about it that way, there's whole companies making tons of money by pushing your buttons and making you more and more reactionary. And even if you are a very practiced connoisseur and consumer of news and news outlets, even the most sober news outlets still contain this news generated by the most outrageous things that, I think if I rewind the clock and, I don't think Dan Rather would have ever talked about half the stuff that we're talking about now, but this is entering our consciousness. So I think it's helpful to recognize this, especially when right there in the Awakening of Faith, it says, the propensity for discrimination of this consciousness will be intensified by both the intellectual defilement of holding fast to perverse views. So both, to some degree, the level of the number of deaths in this country and the social unrest can be traced back to perverse views. Either someone holding very, very fast to a willful disregard for science. And on the other side, people having very, very strong and ingrained views of other people and their level of humanity or lack thereof. So whatever your response, even if you say, well, that news story didn't bother me that much, or I've gotten used to it, it's still in our consciousness. And I think it's helpful to address that in the midst of us talking about a book from the 400s, this is what's going on around us. So I like to, without getting too political, from time to time, just address the bigger issues around us and how that affects our Dharma practice, because that is the tradition in Buddhism. A lot of temples exist because of massive social upheaval, pandemics. I think I mentioned at the beginning, Toji Temple in Nara was built as the head temple for all of Japan, to pray for relief from pandemics. And as that is relevant to Shingon, Kukai was named the head priest of Japan, and he was given the station of the head of Toji. And if you go to Toji to this day, there's a Shingon altar in front of the statue of Vairochana Dainichi that is the largest, or one of the largest statues of the Buddha on earth. So these are not new needs of humanity. These are ongoing needs. How we respond to them is different, but I think the Dharma has been responding to it since the beginning. And I think we need to not distance those issues or separate them from our practice. We need to keep them in mind. So what does that have to do with practice? So there are the three legs of the Buddha stool, so to speak, are moral or ethical education, meditation practice, and then practices for the development of wisdom, or recognizing the development of wisdom that comes from that meditation practice and the study of the moral and ethical principles. So all of that's happening in the Awakening of Faith. The practices come later in the texts, but we're going to do practice now also, and not wait till we get to the end. The moral or ethical teachings are telling us how to free ourselves from trouble, how to get out of and be aware of the causes cause and effect relationship and not cause more trouble for others, right? So at the very least, getting out of other people's way so we're not the cause of problem. I would say, generally speaking, absent, an actual mental defect, most people don't want to commit crime or cause trouble for other people. Most people, when they do it, are misguided. They've gone astray. They have some difficult situations that they're dealing with. But I haven't met a lot of people who aspire to crime. They are usually from very difficult backgrounds and feel like that's the only option they have. So, and I have actually asked them. So I'm not speculating. Meditation, mindfulness practice, you're practicing it to provide mental clarity. So when you encounter these different situations, you can observe actually in real time the mind's reaction, the rising of emotional responses and where those things go. And the more aware you are of it, kind of like magic, you give it less oxygen so it doesn't burn as hot. So not to say that you become unfeeling, but a lot of the things that stem from their emotional response just stop coming about. Speaking of the social unrest, I watched the entire 10-minute video that led to this social unrest. And it's deeply painful to watch someone die. So the question then, after you see it, after you're moved by it, do you take to the street and loot? I'm not judging. I'm just saying what happens as a result. Do you shut yourself in? How do you channel that? And I think at the very least, it is helpful to have a greater awareness of the process of what's coming up and what you're moved to do. So that is something that actually does come from meditation practice. And again, it's available all the time in every situation. So it's about collecting the mind rather than having it scattered. So that's part of what we're doing in meditation practice. And then there's development of wisdom. So meditation alone is insufficient. You actually need to know, okay, I've seen more clearly. What do I do with this realization? And having greater insight into the nature of things around us, seeing the interplay of all these different factors can help us make decisions or lead us to make decisions that are not based on ignorance or a misperception of reality. We're actually going to be able to make decisions based on a much clearer view of the nature of things and how things really are. And that's something that's tremendously beneficial because there's less fixing of things to do later. So when I was younger, I had a lot of fixing to do. Now I have less fixing to do. So that's very nice. So doesn't guarantee everything's going to go well, but I'd rather just deal with the initial issue rather than create more. So what we're going to do tonight is the loving kindness meditation. I think it's helpful because sometimes in the midst of great tragedy, I think losing 100,000 Americans, and I apologize, I'm not aware of our worldwide total at the moment, but in the span of a few months, to lose that many people is something that demands a response of loving kindness. So I think that's a little bit more helpful. What are the benefits of loving kindness? You will find you love more deeply. You have stronger friendships. You're able to transform the difficulties of others. Right? So these are some of the things that come out of that. If you find sometimes encountering difficult situations, you don't know what to say, you may find that you actually are able to find the words. You're able to connect with people because you're able to feel more deeply yourself. So I think this is an important point to make because the solo figure meditating um, sometimes seems aloof, and that's not at all my experience when I've traveled through Asia and met with a lot of Buddhist teachers. They're very deeply feeling, and I've seen many shed tears, even just listening to other people, and sometimes in happiness, and just very deeply feeling, but also having a tremendous amount of insight and wisdom about what comes after the feeling. So we're not at all cutting off feeling. So I think that's always helpful to remind, and also from our own tradition. You know, Kukai's chief student sadly was killed during the construction of the temples in Khorasan, and he wrote quite a bit about his grief about that. Um, and so I reflected on that quite a bit, and someone who wanted to perpetuate a lineage and had poured a great deal of time into training someone, educating them. Naturally, you begin to see a lot of yourself in them, and then to lose that person in the midst of that same endeavor has to be very tragic. But he didn't stop, right? He didn't retreat. He didn't run away from the area. He wrote intently about that grief and continued to build the temple because he understood the benefit. So